The most dangerous words in a marriage are not, "I am leaving." The most dangerous words are, "I am fine," when neither person believes them anymore. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and the morning I left my husband began so quietly that anyone looking from the outside would have thought it was an ordinary Tuesday. The sun had not fully risen yet. The neighborhood was still wrapped in that soft blue light that comes just before dawn. I stood in the kitchen holding a travel mug of coffee, staring out the window at the empty street. For a moment, I wondered if Daniel would wake up before I left. Part of me hoped he would. Another part hoped he would not. After 15 years of marriage, I was tired of having the same conversations. Tired of explaining feelings that never seemed to land where they needed to. Tired of asking to be heard. The strange thing was that Daniel was not a bad man. If someone had asked our friends about him, they would have described him as dependable, hardworking, and kind. They would not have been wrong. He paid the bills. He coached our son's baseball team when he could. He remembered birthdays. He fixed things around the house. From the outside, we looked like a successful family living a comfortable life in suburban America. But marriages do not fall apart because of what people see. They fall apart because of what people miss. For years, I tried to explain that I felt alone even when Daniel was sitting beside me. I told him I was overwhelmed. I told him I was carrying too much. I told him I felt invisible. Every conversation ended the same way. He would listen for a few minutes, promise things would get better, then return to work, responsibilities, and routines. Nothing changed. At first, I believed he simply did not understand. Then I started wondering whether he did understand and just did not think it was serious. That possibility hurt even more. The night before I left, we had dinner together at the same kitchen table where we had shared thousands of meals. There was no argument, no dramatic confrontation. We talked about grocery shopping, our son's school schedule, and an upcoming family birthday party. Looking back, that was the saddest part. We had become experts at discussing everything except the things that actually mattered. When Daniel went upstairs to bed, I stayed behind and sat alone in the living room for nearly 2 hours. The silence felt different that night. Not painful, certain. I realized I had reached a place I never thought I would reach. I was no longer asking whether things would improve. I was asking how much longer I could continue living this way. The answer arrived with unexpected clarity. I could not. So before sunrise, I packed the last of my things into the trunk of my car. I left a short note on the kitchen counter explaining that I was safe and needed time away. Then I stood in the driveway and looked at the house one final time. 15 years of memories lived behind those walls. Some beautiful, some difficult, all of them real. I did not leave because I stopped loving my husband. I left because I finally understood that loving someone should not require losing yourself. As I pulled away from the curb and watched the house disappear in my rearview mirror, I had no idea that the journey ahead would change both of our lives forever. Daniel did not call me immediately. That was the first thing that surprised me. During the 7-hour drive that carried me farther from the life I had known for 15 years, I checked my phone more times than I wanted to admit. Every vibration made my heart jump. Every notification made me wonder if it was him. But the calls never came. By late afternoon, I arrived at a small rental cottage near a lake in northern Minnesota. The place belonged to an old college friend who had offered me a temporary refuge months earlier during one of our long conversations about life. At the time, I laughed at the idea that I might ever need it. Now I stood on the porch holding my suitcase, feeling exhausted and strangely relieved. Meanwhile, nearly 1,000 miles away, Daniel finally woke up and walked downstairs expecting an ordinary morning. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The coffee maker was clean. The kitchen was quiet. Then he saw the note resting on the counter. Later he would tell me that he read it 3 times before, understanding what it meant. The note was short because there was nothing left to explain. We had already discussed the problems dozens of times. Writing another list of disappointments would not have changed anything. According to Daniel, his first reaction was disbelief. He thought I needed a weekend away. Then he thought I was staying with a friend nearby. He convinced himself that I would probably return in a few days after clearing my head. That belief followed him throughout the first week. Life has a strange way of revealing invisible people once they are gone. Daniel began noticing things almost immediately. The laundry basket did not magically empty itself. School forms were not automatically signed and returned. The refrigerator was no longer organized. Appointments were missed. Birthdays required planning. Groceries did not appear on their own. None of these things were dramatic. Individually, they seemed small. Together, they revealed how much of our family life I had been carrying without recognition. Every evening, Daniel came home to a house that felt unfamiliar. The silence bothered him most. For years he had treated my presence as permanent, like the walls, like the roof, like something that would always be there. Now every room reminded him that permanence is often an illusion. During our marriage, I had learned to make myself smaller whenever conflict appeared. I stopped asking for help as often, stopped expressing disappointment, stopped expecting meaningful change. Daniel interpreted that silence as contentment. The truth was much different. It was exhaustion. One evening, about 10 days after I left, our son asked a simple question while Daniel was helping with homework. When is mom coming home? Daniel later admitted that he had no answer. For the first time, he realized he did not actually know. The possibility that I might not return began to feel real. That night, he walked through the house long after everyone else was asleep. He sat in the living room, then the kitchen, then our bedroom. Everywhere he looked, he found reminders of a life he had stopped paying attention to. For the first time in many years, Daniel was not distracted by work deadlines, household routines, or daily responsibilities. He was alone with the truth, and the truth was beginning to make him uncomfortable. Over the next several weeks, life settled into a routine that felt unfamiliar to both of us. I spent my mornings walking along the lakeshore near the cottage. The air was cooler than it had been back home, and the quiet gave me something I had not experienced in years. Space to think, space to breathe, space to hear my own thoughts without immediately placing everyone else's needs ahead of them. For the first time in a long while, I was learning who I was outside the role of wife, mother, planner, caretaker, and problem solver. Back in Illinois, about a month after I left, Daniel experienced the moment that changed everything. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday evening. There was no dramatic event, no shocking discovery, no life-changing phone call. Instead, he found himself sitting alone at the kitchen table after our son had gone to bed. The house was quiet, the same quiet he had been living with for weeks. In front of him sat a stack of old greeting cards I had saved over the years. Some came from birthdays. Others came from anniversaries, holidays, and family celebrations. Daniel had opened the box because he was looking for a document. Instead, he found a record of a marriage neither of us had fully understood. One card caught his attention immediately. It was an anniversary card I had given him nearly 6 years earlier. Inside, I had written a simple message. I thanked him for working hard for our family. I told him I loved him. Then I added a sentence that stopped him cold. I wrote that I hoped one day we would find our way back to each other emotionally, because I missed the man who used to listen when I spoke. Daniel stared at the words for a long time. He barely remembered reading them. Then he opened another card. And another. Similar messages appeared again and again across several years. They were never angry, never demanding. They were invitations, quiet attempts to reconnect, gentle requests to be seen. Looking back, Daniel realized something painful. I had not left suddenly. I had been trying to save our marriage for years. The signs were everywhere. He simply never recognized them. That realization became his yell-and-be moment. For weeks, he had been asking himself why I left. Sitting at that table, he finally asked a different question. Why had I stayed so long? The answer was impossible to ignore. I stayed because I loved him. I stayed because I believed things could improve. I stayed because I wanted our family to work. The problem was not that I quit too soon. The problem was that I carried the relationship almost alone for too long. Daniel later described the feeling as having a curtain pulled away from his eyes. Suddenly, memories that once seemed ordinary looked completely different. Conversations he dismissed as complaints were actually pleas for connection. Moments he considered small were deeply important to me. Promises he forgot were promises I remembered. For the first time, he stopped viewing my departure as an overreaction. He began seeing it as the final result of years of accumulated disappointment. That night, he barely slept. The next morning, he called in sick to work. Instead of opening his laptop, he spent hours walking through the house, confronting memories he had avoided. By afternoon, his decision was made. He was done waiting for me to come home. He was done hoping time would magically solve everything. If he truly understood what he almost lost, then he needed to stop thinking like a husband protecting his pride and start acting like a husband willing to fight for his family. Hundreds of miles away, I was sitting beside the lake watching the water move beneath the afternoon sun, completely unaware that Daniel had reached the turning point that would soon send him on a journey across the country in search of the life we both thought was slipping away forever. 3 days later, Daniel packed a suitcase, arranged for his sister to help with our son's schedule, and pointed his truck north. The decision surprised everyone around him, including himself. In the past, Daniel approached problems with logic. He made lists. He created plans. He waited for situations to settle down on their own. This time felt different. For the first time, he understood that waiting had become part of the problem. Every mile that carried him farther from home also carried him deeper into reflection. The highways stretched endlessly ahead, crossing farmland, small towns, and long stretches of open road. With nothing but time and distance, Daniel found himself replaying years of memories. He remembered the countless evenings I sat beside him hoping for a conversation while he stared at a screen. He remembered weekends when I asked for help and he promised to do more later. He remembered moments when I looked disappointed and he assumed the feeling would pass. Each memory carried a weight it never had before. What troubled him most was not what he had done. It was what he had failed to do. He had failed to notice, failed to ask deeper questions, failed to understand that love requires attention just as much as it requires commitment. Meanwhile, my life near the lake continued moving at a slower pace. The quiet had become familiar. I spent mornings reading on the porch and afternoons walking trails that wound through pine forests and along the shoreline. The distance from home had given me perspective. For years, my entire identity revolved around taking care of everyone else. Now I was discovering simple pleasures I had forgotten. I no longer rushed through every day. I no longer felt responsible for fixing every problem. For the first time in a long while, I felt peaceful. That peace was exactly why I hesitated whenever Daniel called. I listened to every voicemail. Each one sounded more sincere than the last. Yet sincerity alone could not erase years of hurt. One evening, after nearly 8 hours on the road, Daniel stopped at a small motel outside Minneapolis. Instead of turning on the television, he sat at the edge of the bed staring at his phone. He began writing something. Not a speech, not an apology, a list. At the top of the page, he wrote a simple question. What does Sarah need from me now? The answers that followed surprised him. He did not write forgiveness. He did not write reconciliation. He did not write another chance. Instead, he wrote honesty, accountability, patience, consistency, respect, understanding. Looking at the list, Daniel realized that for years he had focused on keeping the family functioning. He had not focused enough on helping the people inside that family feel valued. The next morning, he resumed the drive. Hundreds of miles still separated us. Yet something important had already changed. Daniel was no longer traveling across the country to convince me to come back. He was traveling across the country to become the kind of husband who deserved the opportunity to ask. The call came the following afternoon. I had just returned from a walk along the lakeshore when my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen again. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer this time. Neither of us spoke immediately. The silence stretched for several seconds before he finally said my name. His voice sounded tired. Not physically tired. Emotionally tired. Like someone carrying a truth that had become too heavy to ignore. We talked for less than 10 minutes. Most of the conversation was simple. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was fine. He asked if I felt safe. I said yes. Then he surprised me. Instead of asking when I was coming home, he said something I had never heard from him before. I think I finally understand why you left. The words caught me off guard. For years, I had imagined what that sentence might sound like. Yet hearing it now felt strangely complicated. Part of me wanted to believe him. Another part remembered how many times I had hoped things would change before. When the conversation ended, I stood on the porch staring at the phone in my hand. Something was different. I could feel it. The question was whether different meant permanent or temporary. The answer arrived 2 days later. Early that morning, my friend called from town. Her voice carried a mixture of surprise and concern. She told me a man had been asking around the area looking for a woman named Sarah Mitchell. My stomach immediately tightened. I knew exactly who it was. A few hours later, there was a knock at the cottage door. I opened it and found Daniel standing on the porch. For a moment, neither of us moved. The sight of him felt surreal. More than a month had passed since I left. Yet suddenly there he was, hundreds of miles from home, looking both familiar and completely different. His clothes were wrinkled from travel. His eyes looked tired. But what stood out most was the expression on his face. The confidence he usually carried was gone. In its place was humility. He was no longer standing there as a husband expecting answers. He was standing there as a man hoping for a chance to listen. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. I considered saying no. The truth was that part of me wanted to protect the peace I had finally found. But another part knew this conversation had been waiting to happen for years. We sat outside, overlooking the lake. The afternoon sun reflected across the water while a cool breeze moved through the trees around us. For several minutes, Daniel simply looked out at the horizon. Then he began speaking. What happened next surprised me more than his arrival. He did not defend himself. He did not explain away the past. He did not tell me I was wrong. Instead, he acknowledged specific moments. Conversations he ignored. Promises he failed to keep. Feelings he dismissed because he thought there would always be time to address them later. Listening to him felt strange because for the first time in years, I did not feel interrupted. I did not feel corrected. I did not feel dismissed. When he finally stopped speaking, his eyes met mine. "I am not here to convince you to come home," he said. "I am here because I should have listened a long time ago. And if you never come back, I still needed you to know that I understand now." For the first time since I left, I saw the man I had been hoping to reach all along. The conversation beside the lake lasted nearly 3 hours. By the time the sun began sinking toward the horizon, I felt emotionally exhausted. Not because Daniel argued with me. Not because he tried to change my mind. Quite the opposite. For the first time in our marriage, he seemed willing to sit with uncomfortable truths without rushing to fix them or explain them away. Yet even as I listened, a question remained in the back of my mind. Was this real change or simply fear of losing me? The distinction mattered more than anything. Many people apologize when consequences arrive. Far fewer change after the consequences appear. Before leaving that evening, Daniel asked if he could stay in town for a few days. He made it clear he was not expecting daily visits or long conversations. He simply wanted the opportunity to be nearby. I agreed, though part of me still felt uncertain. Over the next week, something unexpected happened. Daniel stopped focusing on what he wanted and started focusing on what needed to be repaired. Every morning, he called our son before school. Every afternoon, he handled responsibilities that previously would have fallen entirely on me. He coordinated schedules, managed appointments, and dealt with the endless stream of small tasks that keep a household running. None of these actions were dramatic. In many ways, that was exactly why they mattered. For years, I carried countless responsibilities that often went unnoticed. Now Daniel was finally experiencing them firsthand. More importantly, he was no longer treating them as someone else's job. One afternoon, while we were walking along a trail near the lake, he told me something that stayed with me. He said he used to believe being a good husband meant working hard and providing stability. Those things mattered, but now he understood they were only part of the equation. Emotional presence mattered too. Listening mattered. Partnership mattered. Understanding mattered. I noticed something else as the days passed. Daniel stopped asking when I was coming home. He stopped pushing for answers about our future. Instead, he focused entirely on becoming accountable for the past. That shift changed the way I viewed him. For years, many of our conversations felt transactional. He listened long enough to move forward. Now he seemed willing to stay in difficult conversations even when there was no immediate solution. One evening, we sat on a bench overlooking the water as the sky turned shades of orange and gold. Daniel handed me a folded piece of paper. It was the list he had written in the motel room during his drive across the country. At the top remained the same question. What does Sarah need from me now? Underneath were the words he had written weeks earlier. Honesty, accountability, patience, consistency, respect, understanding. Looking at the page, I realized something important. The list contained nothing about getting me back. It contained everything about becoming a better partner. That difference mattered. More than flowers. More than promises. More than apologies. As I handed the paper back to him, I felt the first small crack appear in the protective wall I had built around my heart. The hurt was still there. The caution was still there. But for the first time since leaving home, hope quietly returned as well. Not hope that everything would magically be fixed. Hope that perhaps the man sitting beside me was finally becoming the person I had needed all along. The following week brought a change neither of us expected. For the first time since I left, we stopped talking about the past every day. Not because the past no longer mattered, but because we had finally acknowledged it honestly. The constant focus on old wounds gradually gave way to conversations about who we wanted to become moving forward. That shift felt small at first, yet it changed everything. One morning, Daniel joined me for coffee on the porch overlooking the lake. The air carried the crisp feeling of early autumn. We sat quietly watching sunlight move across the water. Years earlier, silence between us often felt uncomfortable. One of us would eventually fill it with practical concerns or unfinished responsibilities. This silence felt different, peaceful. Neither of us seemed eager to escape it. During those days, I paid close attention to Daniel's actions. Not because I wanted to judge him, because trust had to be rebuilt carefully. Words could create hope. Consistency created belief. Every day offered another opportunity for him to prove that his change was real. And every day he showed up. He called our son without fail. He remained patient during difficult conversations. He accepted responsibility without becoming defensive. Most importantly, he listened, truly listened, not waiting for his turn to speak, not preparing a response, simply listening. One afternoon, we visited a small bookstore in town. While browsing through the shelves, I wandered into a section filled with journals and personal development books. When I turned around, I noticed Daniel standing several feet away reading something quietly. Later, I discovered it was a book about communication and emotional connection in long-term relationships. In the past, he might have considered something like that unnecessary. Now he approached it with genuine curiosity. The realization touched me more than I expected. Growth often appears in ordinary moments. The biggest breakthrough came several days later. We were walking along the shoreline when Daniel asked a question he had never asked before. What were the hardest moments for you? The question itself was simple. Yet for years he had focused on solving problems instead of understanding experiences. For nearly an hour, I shared memories I had carried alone. Times when I felt invisible. Times when I felt unsupported. Times when I questioned my own worth because my efforts seemed unnoticed. Daniel listened without interruption. Occasionally tears appeared in his eyes. Not because he wanted sympathy, because he was finally allowing himself to understand the impact of his absence even while physically present. That evening, after he left the cottage, I sat alone thinking about the conversation. Something inside me had shifted. The wall protecting my heart no longer felt quite as solid as before. The hurt had not disappeared. Neither had the caution. But the resentment that once occupied so much space was slowly fading. In its place was something far more complicated. Respect. Not for who Daniel used to be, but for the difficult work he was doing now. A few days later, Daniel prepared to return home. Before leaving, he told me there was no pressure, no deadline, no expectation. He would continue working on himself whether I returned or not. Then he hugged me goodbye and drove away. As I watched his truck disappear down the road, I realized something important. For the first time in many years, I was not thinking about whether Daniel loved me. I knew he did. The question now was whether we could build something stronger than what we had before. And for the first time since I left, the answer felt possible. Months passed, and the rhythm of our life began to feel like something new yet familiar. Each morning, I woke to the sound of our son laughing somewhere in the house and Daniel preparing breakfast without rush or complaint. There was no grand announcement that everything was perfect, but perfection was not the goal. Healing was. One Saturday afternoon, we ventured to the local park, bringing a picnic along with a blanket and a frisbee. Our son ran ahead, fearless and full of joy, and we followed slowly, watching him. Daniel held my hand lightly. A gesture that had once been routine, now felt intentional and meaningful. As we sat under the shade of a large oak tree, I noticed a quiet confidence in him that had not existed before. Not arrogance, not pride, but a calm awareness of responsibility and care. Over the next few weeks, small but consistent actions strengthened our bond. He volunteered to help with school projects, offered to drive our son to soccer practice, and spent evenings talking about his day without expectation of reciprocation. He listened to the stories I shared of my childhood and encouraged our son to ask questions and explore. These actions, mundane to an outside observer, were monumental in rebuilding the foundation of trust. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden light across our backyard, Daniel and I sat side by side watching our son play. We had begun discussing dreams for the future, trips we might take, small changes we wanted to implement at home to create a sense of harmony. For the first time in many years, Our conversations were free from blame, regret, and resentment. We spoke of growth, responsibility, and kindness. It was a dialogue rooted in honesty and empathy. One night, after tucking our son into bed, Daniel approached with a stack of old letters and journals he had found tucked away in the attic. He handed them to me silently, his eyes soft but questioning. I realized he had been reading my words of years past, not to criticize but to understand. Tears came, not from sadness, but from the weight of acknowledgement. I had carried these experiences alone for so long, and now someone truly saw them. In that moment, I recognized a profound truth. Relationships are not repaired in a single grand gesture, but in the quiet, persistent choices to act with care, understanding, and humility. Together, we had begun to rebuild something stronger than what had been lost, a family anchored not just in shared space, but in trust, respect, and love. And in that knowledge, we found peace, a sense of completeness that had once seemed impossible.